The most powerful men are often the easiest to surprise because they forget that miracles rarely arrive wearing expensive clothes. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers of downtown Chicago as Ethan Cole stepped out of the headquarters of Cole International. At 38 years old, he had built an empire that stretched across continents. His black suit looked perfect, and the faint tattoo along the side of his neck only added to the cold authority that surrounded him. Two bodyguards followed several steps behind while a sleek black car waited by the curb. People lowered their voices when he passed. Some admired him. Others feared him. None of them truly knew him. Ethan checked his watch. Another meeting waited in 20 minutes, followed by dinner with investors and a late-night flight to New York. Every hour of his life was carefully planned. Then a small voice interrupted the noise of the city. Mr. Ethan Cole. He stopped immediately. Very few strangers ever used his full name. Standing beside a flower cart was a little girl wearing a faded yellow sweater and carrying a backpack decorated with tiny stars. She could not have been older than 8. Her curly brown hair moved gently in the breeze, and her eyes were calm in a way that felt strangely unusual for a child. Ethan looked around, expecting an adult to appear. No one did. "Are you talking to me?" he asked. The little girl nodded. "I have been looking for you." One of the bodyguards stepped forward, but Ethan raised a hand. "Do I know you?" The girl shook her head. "No." "Then how do you know my name?" She smiled softly. "Someone told me where to find you." Ethan frowned. "Who?" The little girl glanced toward the sky for a brief moment and then looked back at him. "A person who believed you would come." The answer made no sense, yet something about her voice made him curious. "What is your name?" "Emma." "And why exactly were you looking for me, Emma?" She took a small step closer. "Because you forgot something important." For a second, he almost smiled. Children often said unusual things, but the way she looked at him made it feel less like a game and more like a secret. The city continued, moving around them. Cars passed. Traffic lights changed. Someone laughed across the street. Yet the strange little girl remained perfectly calm. She reached in her pocket and pulled out a tiny wooden star hanging from string. She held it carefully for a moment before putting it away again. Ethan stared at it. Something about the star felt familiar, though he could not explain why. "Stay quiet," Emma said softly, "and follow me." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they carried a strange certainty. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Then it vibrated again. He ignored it. The little girl turned and began walking down the sidewalk without looking back. Ethan remained where he was for several seconds. His schedule was full. His responsibilities were endless. Following a child he had never met was completely unreasonable. Yet for reasons he could not understand, he suddenly felt as though this moment had been waiting for him for a very long time. Finally, he looked at his bodyguards. "Stay here," he said quietly. Then he stepped away from his waiting car and followed the little girl into the crowd, unaware that every step was leading him toward a forgotten promise and a place he had once called home. Emma walked through the busy streets of downtown Chicago, as though she had a destination she had visited many times before. Ethan followed a few steps behind her, his polished dress, shoes clicking softly against the sidewalk. Every few minutes, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it each time. The little girl never looked back to see if he was still there. Somehow, she seemed completely certain that he would follow. They turned away from the towering office buildings and entered an older part of the city where the streets became quieter. The glass skyscrapers slowly disappeared behind rows of brick stores and family-owned businesses. A bakery filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. A flower shop displayed colorful pots along the sidewalk. A man sweeping outside a grocery store smiled warmly when he saw Emma. "Good afternoon, sweetheart." She waved cheerfully. "Hi, Mr. Daniels." A few doors later, an elderly woman sitting outside a small cafe greeted her by name. "Emma, your sweater looks beautiful today." The little girl smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Green." Ethan watched the exchange with growing curiosity. "You know everyone around here?" he asked. Emma looked up at him. "Most of them." "That is impressive." She shrugged. "People talk to each other here." The answer was simple, but it somehow made him uncomfortable. In his world, people exchanged contracts and business cards. They rarely stopped to learn each other's names. They continued walking until they reached a narrow street, lined with old maple trees. The neighborhood felt strangely familiar. Ethan slowed his steps. He had not been here in years, perhaps even decades. Then Emma stopped in front of an old ice cream shop on the corner. The faded sign above the door still hung exactly where it always had. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. "No," he whispered. Emma turned toward him. "You know this place?" He nodded slowly. "My father used to bring me here every Saturday." The memory arrived suddenly. He could almost smell chocolate ice cream and hear his father's laughter. He remembered sitting beside the window while his father talked about kindness, responsibility, and taking care of people who needed help. For years, those memories had remained buried beneath endless meetings and business deals. "You look sad," Emma said softly. Ethan blinked and realized he had not spoken for several seconds. "I was just remembering someone." The little girl smiled gently. "Someone you loved." He looked at her in surprise. "How did you know that?" She simply pointed at his face. People smile differently when they remember someone they love. He almost laughed at the wisdom of the child standing before him. Instead, he found himself looking at the old shop once again. The late afternoon sun painted the street in shades of gold and orange. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime softly rang. Emma suddenly started walking again. "Come on," she said quietly. "We are almost there." Ethan followed her down another block. Then she stopped in front of a small white fence covered with climbing flowers. Beyond it stood an old brick building surrounded by a garden. He felt his heart stop. Above the entrance hung a wooden sign that he had not seen in many years. The words were simple, but they changed everything. Knight Family Community Center. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the little girl had not brought him somewhere new at all. She had brought him back to a place he had tried to forget. For several long seconds, Ethan simply stood outside the white fence, staring at the old brick building. The garden looked exactly as he remembered it. The flower beds still surrounded the entrance, and the maple tree beside the walkway had grown taller but remained in the same place. It felt impossible. He had convinced himself that this place had disappeared years ago. Yet here it stood, quiet and warm in the golden light of late afternoon. Emma opened the small gate and looked back at him. "Come on," she said softly. Ethan followed her through the garden. The scent of flowers filled the air, and from somewhere inside the building came the sound of children laughing. The sound struck him unexpectedly. It was the same laughter he had heard on opening day many years earlier when his father stood proudly beside him. At the entrance hung a bronze plaque. Ethan stopped in front of it. His fingers slowly touched the faded metal. "Built in loving memory of Daniel Cole, who believed every child deserves a place to dream." His father's name seemed to glow beneath the setting sun. Memories returned one after another. He remembered carrying boxes of books into the library. He remembered painting walls with volunteers. Most of all, he remembered making a promise. "I will take care of this place." The front door suddenly opened. Several children ran outside, carrying paper airplanes made from brightly colored paper. They laughed as they chased one another through the garden. Behind them walked a woman carrying a stack of books against her chest. She wore a light blue sweater and dark jeans, and there was a calm kindness in her face that seemed to belong perfectly to this place. One little boy stopped beside her. "Miss Naomi, can we play outside for a little longer?" She smiled warmly. 10 more minutes. Then she looked toward the entrance and saw Ethan, standing beside the plaque. Surprise filled her expression. "Mr. Cole?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, still unable to find the right words. Emma ran toward the woman and hugged her around the waist. "I found him," she announced proudly. Naomi laughed softly and rested a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "I can see that." Then she looked back at Ethan. "Please come inside." He stepped through the doorway almost without thinking. The community center smelled of old books, crayons, and fresh cookies. Children's paintings covered the walls, and colorful paper stars hung from the ceiling. Everything looked simple and worn, yet somehow beautiful. It felt alive. Naomi led him into a small office near the back of the building. On the desk sat a framed photograph. Ethan picked it up and immediately froze. It showed him standing beside his father on the day the community center had opened. Both of them were smiling. He could not remember the last time he had looked that happy. "Where did you get this?" he asked softly. Naomi looked at the photograph. "It has always been here." She paused for a moment. "Just like the promise you made." The room became very quiet. Outside, children laughed in the garden while paper airplanes floated through the evening light. Ethan slowly placed the photograph back on the desk. For the first time in years, he began to understand that the little girl had not brought him to a forgotten building. She had brought him back to a forgotten part of himself. The evening sunlight poured through the office window, painting the room in shades of gold. Ethan continued looking at the old photograph on the desk. He could not stop staring at the younger version of himself standing beside his father. There had once been warmth in his smile, a kind of hope he barely recognized anymore. He carefully placed the frame back where it belonged. "I made a promise," he said quietly. Naomi nodded. "You did." She walked to a nearby shelf and picked up a small notebook with worn edges. "This place almost closed several times, but I could never lock the doors." Ethan looked at her. "How long have you been here?" "Almost 7 years." 7 years. She smiled. Softly. "I came here to volunteer after moving into the neighborhood. Then one day, I realized the children needed someone to stay." Through the office window, he could see several children sitting beneath the maple tree making paper airplanes. "And now," he asked. Naomi looked around the room. "Now I take care of whatever needs to be done." She opened the notebook and handed it to him. Every page was filled with numbers and lists written in neat handwriting. Grocery expenses, school supplies, repair costs, utility bills. Ethan frowned. "What is this?" "The center's expenses." He turned another page. "Where is the foundation money?" Naomi hesitated for a moment. "We stopped receiving support years ago." Ethan slowly looked up. "That cannot be right." "I thought so too." She sat across from him. "At first I believed there had been a mistake. Then I assumed everyone had simply forgotten about us." The words seemed to settle heavily in the room. He closed the notebook. "Who has been paying for all of this?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I used my savings for a while. Then neighbors started helping. The bakery donates bread. The grocery store gives us extra supplies. Parents volunteer whenever they can." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "You kept this place alive by yourself?" She gently shook her head. "No, we kept it alive together." At that moment, Emma appeared in the doorway carrying a small cardboard box decorated with colorful stars. "Can I show him?" she asked excitedly. Naomi smiled. "Of course." The little girl placed the box on the desk and carefully removed the lid. Inside were coins and a few folded dollar bills. "What is this?" Ethan asked. Emma smiled proudly. "Our library money." "Library money?" She nodded. "We save a little every year so we can buy books." She pointed to several coins. "I sold lemonade last summer. Tommy gave $2 from his birthday money. Mrs. Green bought cookies from us." Ethan looked at the box again. There could not have been more than $50 inside. Yet the little girl held it as if it were treasure. Then she pulled a drawing from the bottom of the box. It showed the community center filled with children and decorations. Near the front was a single empty chair. Ethan pointed toward it. "Who sits there?" Emma looked surprised by the question. "You do." He blinked. "Me?" She nodded. "We leave it empty every spring during our festival." "Why?" The little girl smiled softly. "Because Mom said people who make promises sometimes get lost, but if you save a place for them, they can still find their way back." The room became completely silent. Outside, children laughed in the garden while the evening breeze moved through the flowers. Ethan looked at the empty chair and the drawing and felt something tighten in his chest. For years, he had forgotten this place completely. Yet every spring, children who had never met him had been saving him a seat and waiting for him to come home. The drawing remained in Ethan's hands long after Emma had stopped speaking. The empty chair in the picture seemed far heavier than a simple sketch made with crayons. He imagined every spring festival, every gathering, every celebration that had taken place inside these walls while a seat remained empty for a man who had forgotten the place completely. Emma carefully closed the box of coins and looked up at him. "Would you like to see something else?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. The little girl smiled and ran toward a wooden cabinet standing near the office window. She opened one of the drawers and pulled out a stack of envelopes tied together with a blue ribbon. The edges had turned slightly yellow with time. She carried them back as though they were something precious. "These are for you." Ethan frowned. "For me?" Emma nodded. "The children write letters every year." He carefully untied the ribbon and looked at the first envelope. On the front, written in large, uneven letters, were the words to Mr. Ethan Cole. He slowly opened it. Inside was a drawing of a library filled with books. Beneath it, a child had written, "Dear Mr. Cole, thank you for building our reading room. I want to become a teacher someday. I hope you visit us one day." The next letter came from another child. "Dear Mr. Cole, I learned how to play the piano here. My mother says this place changed our lives. I made cookies for the spring festival. I saved one for you in case you come." Ethan swallowed hard and reached for another. "Dear Mr. Cole, I do not know you, but Miss Naomi says this center exists because your father loved helping people and because you promised to keep his dream alive. I hope you are happy wherever you are." There were dozens of letters. Some included drawings of flowers and stars. Some contained little stories about school, birthdays, and dreams for the future. One letter simply said, "I hope you do not forget us." Another read, "Thank you for giving us a place that feels like home." Ethan's hands became still. The room around him seemed to disappear. He looked at the stack of envelopes and realized that these children had spent years writing to a man who never answered because he never even knew the letters existed. Naomi quietly sat across from him. "They write new ones every spring," she said softly. "I never had the heart to throw them away." He looked up. "Why did you keep them?" She smiled gently. "Because hope deserves a place to stay." Outside the window, the sky had turned soft shades of pink and orange. Children's laughter floated through the garden. Ethan carefully placed the letters back on the desk. "I do not deserve this," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe not," she answered honestly. "But they never stopped believing you would come." Emma stepped closer and touched one of the envelopes. "Mom always said people can lose their way, but that does not mean they stop being important." The little girl's words settled deeply inside him. For years he had believed he had left this neighborhood behind forever. Yet here, inside an old brick building, sat a box of letters proving that an entire community had never forgotten his name and had been waiting for him to remember theirs. The office had grown quiet. The last rays of sunlight rested across the desk, illuminating the stack of letters and the little box of coins. Ethan sat without speaking, his hand still resting on the blue ribbon that held the envelopes together. Then Emma reached in her backpack and carefully pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. She unfolded the cloth and revealed the tiny wooden star he had seen earlier on the street. This time he looked at it more closely. One side of the star was scratched and worn with age. On the back, written in faded ink, were 3 words. "Keep the door open." Ethan's breath caught. He knew those words. He had heard them years ago. His father used to say them every time they locked the community center at night. As long as there is hope, he would say, "Keep the door open." Ethan looked at Emma. "Where did you get this?" The little girl's smile faded slightly. "My mom gave it to me." Naomi lowered her eyes. A gentle silence filled the room. "Your mother?" Ethan asked softly. Emma nodded. "She used to work here." The little girl carefully sat beside him and held the wooden star between her hands. "She said this place saved her when she was young. She met kind people here and learned how to believe in herself again." Ethan listened quietly. "Before she got sick, she told me there was someone important I needed to find someday." Emma looked directly at him. "She said if I ever felt alone, I should find the man whose name was on the building." The room became very still. "She told me to give you this." The little girl placed the wooden star into his hand. "And she said to remind you that promises do not disappear." Ethan closed his fingers around the small piece of wood. Naomi stood and walked to a cabinet near the window. After a moment, she returned carrying a single white envelope. It had been carefully preserved inside a clear folder. "There is something else," she said quietly. "Your name is on it." Ethan looked at the handwriting on the envelope. It was neat and graceful. For a long moment, he could not move. Then he slowly opened it. Inside was a short letter. "Dear Mr. Cole, you do not know me, but you once helped change my life by creating this place with your father. If this letter ever reaches you, I hope you remember that there are still children here who need this center. My daughter believes you will come back one day. I hope she's right. Please do not let this place become another forgotten memory. And if you can, keep the door open. Ethan read the final line twice. Then a small sentence at the bottom caught his attention. Thank you for giving me one place in the world where I never felt alone. His hands trembled slightly. He looked at Emma, who sat quietly beside him. When did your mother write this? Naomi answered softly. A few weeks before she passed away last year. The evening light had almost disappeared now, and the room glowed softly beneath a small lamp on the desk. Ethan folded the letter carefully and looked at the wooden star in his hand. Somewhere in this old building, children were still laughing. Somewhere in this neighborhood, people had never stopped believing in a promise he had forgotten. And for the first time in many years, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. Someone still believed he could find his way back. That night, Ethan did not return to his penthouse immediately. He sat alone in the back seat of his car with the small wooden star resting in his hand and the letter folded carefully inside his jacket pocket. The lights of Chicago passed outside the window, but he barely noticed them. Every few minutes he read the last line of the letter again. Please do not let this place become another forgotten memory. He finally closed his eyes. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him had been awake since the moment Emma called his name on the sidewalk. The next morning, he arrived at his office before sunrise. His assistant nearly dropped her coffee when she saw him. Mr. Cole, you have meetings beginning at 8. Ethan removed his coat and walked straight into the conference room. Cancel them. She blinked. All of them. Every single one. 10 minutes later, senior executives from the Cole Foundation sat around a long table looking confused. Financial reports and folders covered the polished wood surface. Ethan stood near the window holding the small wooden star in one hand. I need every document connected to the Knight Family Community Center, he said. The room became quiet. An older executive cleared his throat. That center still exists. Ethan slowly turned around. Apparently, it does. More files arrived over the next hour. The deeper he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. The community center had once been part of a larger family foundation created by his father. After his father's death, management of the charitable projects had been transferred to several administrators while Ethan focused on building the company. Over time, budgets had been reduced, reports had become shorter, and eventually the center had almost disappeared from official discussions altogether. Yet every year, a small amount of money was still approved for maintenance. Ethan looked up from the reports. Where do these funds go? No one answered immediately. A woman sitting near the end of the table spoke softly. Most of the foundation projects were reorganized years ago. The center was considered a low priority. Low priority. The words sounded terrible. He thought of Emma's box filled with coins and children saving money for books. He thought of Naomi using her own savings to keep the doors open. He looked down at the wooden star again. A place that changes children's lives became a low priority. No one dared answer him. Finally, he closed the files. That ends today. The room remained completely still. Restore the entire budget. Increase it if necessary. I want repairs completed, new educational programs created, and every expense covered. He paused for a moment. And I want a full review of every foundation project that has been forgotten. Several people immediately began taking notes. Ethan looked through the glass wall of the conference room toward the city beyond. For years, he had believed success meant moving forward and never looking back. Yet the most important thing in his life had been waiting quietly behind him all along. A week later, workers began arriving at the community center. Fresh paint, books, computers, and boxes of supplies slowly filled the old building. Children gathered in the garden, watching with wide eyes. Then a black car stopped outside the white fence. Emma saw it first. She ran toward the gate, just as Ethan stepped out carrying a stack of new books in his arms. The little girl smiled so brightly that he could not help smiling back. You came back, she said softly. Ethan looked at the open front door of the community center and then at the child standing before him. I think, he said gently, I finally found my way home. The following weeks changed the old community center more than anyone thought possible. Fresh paint covered the faded walls. New books filled empty shelves. Broken chairs were replaced, computers arrived for the small study room, and colorful flowers appeared in the garden. Every day after school, children gathered near the entrance just to watch the workers and ask questions. The building seemed to wake up after a long sleep. Ethan visited almost every evening. At first, he came to check on the repairs, but before long he realized he was staying for entirely different reasons. He helped carry boxes into the library, listened to children talk about their dreams, and even learned the names of everyone in the neighborhood. The people who once knew his father now greeted him with warm smiles. One afternoon, he arrived carrying a large box of art supplies. Before he could even close the car door, Emma ran across the garden. "You are late," she announced. Ethan looked at his watch. 3 minutes. She crossed her arms in a serious manner. "That still counts." He laughed softly and held up the box. "I brought colored pencils." Her serious expression disappeared immediately. "You are forgiven." Together, they carried the box inside. The main room looked brighter than ever. Paper stars and children's drawings covered the walls. Naomi stood on a ladder, hanging new curtains by the windows. She climbed down when she saw them. "I never imagined this place could look like this again," she said quietly. Ethan looked around the room. "Neither did I." She smiled. The children cannot stop talking about the library. At that moment, several children rushed inside, carrying pieces of colored paper. "Miss Naomi, can we make more stars?" one of them asked. "Of course," she answered. Soon the tables filled with paper, markers, and scissors. Ethan sat beside Emma and watched her carefully cut out a blue star. "What are these for?" he asked. The little girl looked surprised. "For the promise wall." She pointed toward one side of the room. Dozens of colorful stars already covered the wall. Each one had a message written on it. "I want to be a doctor. I want to help people. I want my mom to smile again." Ethan walked closer and read them one by one. Then Emma handed him a blank star and a marker. "You need one too." He looked at the paper in his hand for a long moment. Finally, he wrote 4 simple words. "I will stay this time." Emma smiled when she read it. She carefully placed a star near the center of the wall. Then he noticed something hanging above all the paper stars. It was the tiny wooden star her mother had left behind. Beneath it, someone had written a sentence in small letters. "Keep the door open." The room suddenly grew quiet in his heart. He looked around him. Children laughed while making decorations. Naomi arranged books on the shelves with a gentle smile. Sunlight poured through the windows and painted everything in warm shades of gold. For years he had searched for success in boardrooms and skyscrapers, never realizing that the most important place in his life was a small brick building filled with hope. As he looked at the wooden star hanging above the promise wall, Ethan understood something at last. He had not come here to save this community center. Somehow, this community center had saved him. 6 months later, spring returned to Chicago and painted the neighborhood in bright colors. The garden outside the community center was filled with blooming flowers, paper decorations, and long tables covered with homemade desserts. Laughter floated through the warm afternoon air. The annual spring festival had finally returned. Families filled the courtyard while children ran across the grass, carrying colorful paper stars. Above the entrance, the old wooden sign had been restored, and the windows glowed with light and life. The Knight Family Community Center no longer looked forgotten. It looked loved. Ethan stood near the garden gate, wearing a simple navy sweater instead of one of his expensive suits. The small wooden star still hung from his keychain. He had not missed a single Friday at the center in 6 months. Somewhere along the way, the building had stopped feeling like a responsibility and had started feeling like home. "You are early today," Emma said as she walked toward him carrying a tray of cookies. Ethan smiled. "I did not want to be late again." She nodded with satisfaction. "Good decision." Together, they walked into the garden. Near the maple tree, Naomi was helping several children hang paper stars from long ribbons. The afternoon sunlight rested gently on her face as she smiled at the children. When she saw Ethan, she waved. "Everything is ready," she said. I think this may be our biggest festival yet. He looked around at the families, the flowers, and the decorations. It is beautiful. A few minutes later, the children gathered near a small wooden stage. Emma climbed onto it and held a piece of paper in both hands. She looked nervous. Naomi gave her an encouraging smile. The little girl took a deep breath. Every year, she began, we celebrate this place because it reminds us that people care about each other. The courtyard became quiet. My mom used to say that even when people get lost, love leaves a light on for them. Emma looked directly at Ethan, and sometimes they find their way back. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the little girl smiled. Thank you for coming home. The entire garden filled with applause. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He looked at the people around him and realized something extraordinary. These families were not clapping because he had donated money or repaired a building. They were welcoming him back into a place where he belonged. After the celebration, Emma led him to the promise wall inside the community center. Hundreds of paper stars now covered it. In the center still hung the little wooden star left by her mother. Beneath it, his own paper star remained exactly where Emma had placed it months earlier. I will stay this time. He looked at the words for a long moment. Then he turned toward the open front door. Children's laughter echoed from the garden. The smell of fresh cookies drifted inside. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor. For years, he had believed success meant owning the tallest buildings and the biggest companies. Yet peace had been waiting for him in a small brick building at the end of an old street. Emma gently slipped her hand into his. Are you happy now? She asked softly. Ethan smiled and looked around the room. Yes, he answered. I think I finally understand something. What? He looked at the little girl beside him. Home is not a place you build. It is a place that never stops waiting for you. Outside, the spring breeze moved through the garden and carried the sound of laughter through the open door. And on that quiet afternoon, a man who had once forgotten a promise finally remembered who he was.